The town laughed when Alara Vance, 17 and alone, began building a badger den into a Dakota hill. Guided by her father's journal, she engineered a double-walled sanctuary using thermal mass and air gaps, her hands bleeding from the stone. The community, led by blacksmith Josiah Coble, mocked her retreat from proper log cabins. Then the historic blizzard of 1881 struck with murderous cold, shattering their homes. As the wind screamed, the only shelter left was Alara's derided hole in the ground, and the very skeptics who laughed now pounded on her door begging to be let in. The Dakota Territory, 1880, was a land of relentless truth. It told its truths in the scarring bite of the wind, in the brittle whisper of dead grass, and in the deep, patient silence of the stone beneath the thin skin of soil. For 17-year-old Alara Vance, the most piercing truth had been delivered just before the first frost. The cough that had taken her mother 2 winters past had returned with a vengeance for her father. Now, she stood alone on the claim shanty's stoop, save for the warm, silent pressure of Fenn's shoulder against her thigh. The shepherd mix, with his intelligent amber eyes and coat the color of prairie dust, was the sole living being who shared her memory of their family's laughter. Her inheritance was a quarter-section of stubborn land, a ramshackle shanty that groaned in every wind, and her father's most prized possession, his grandfather's journal. Thaddeus Vance had been an engineer from Boston who dreamed of frontier triumph but succumbed to its realities within 5 years. His journal, however, was not a chronicle of failure. It was a dense, precise record of observation. He had sketched the lay of the land, charted water tables, and with the eye of a man who understood forces and loads, documented the structures of the native creatures. It was this journal that Alara pored over by the weak light of a tallow lamp as the autumn nights grew longer. The shanty's chinks, stuffed with mud and straw, bled heat like an open wound. Her breath fogged the air, and Fenn curled tightly into a ball, his nose tucked under his tail. Her father had often read passages aloud, his voice fond and wondering. One entry in particular now held her gaze. October 12. Observe the badger on the southern ridge. The creature works not with timber, but with the earth itself. Its den is dug deep into the south, facing slope with a long entry that turns sharply. I estimate the chamber sits a full 10 feet beneath the surface. The principles are sound. The earth is a magnificent insulator. The temperature below the frost line remains constant, a reservoir of coolness in summer and of stored geothermal warmth in winter. The entry turn baffles the wind, a simple, brilliant application of sheltering. In the margin, he had scribbled a single, tantalizing phrase. Could a root cellar be improved upon? A living cellar. The genius idea, when it came, was not a single bolt of lightning, but a slow, dawning sunrise. It began with her root cellar, a crude, damp hole dug into a nearby hillock. While the shanty above swung between oven and icebox, the cellar maintained a constant, cool chill. Thaddeus's journal provided the key to transforming observation into intention. If the earth could keep a potato cellar cool in summer, could it not also keep a living space warm in winter? The concept was earth sheltering, using the mass of the soil itself as a buffer against the extreme temperatures of the surface world. But Alara's mind, sharpened by loneliness and necessity, went further. She recalled her father speaking of thermal mass, how dense materials like stone or earth absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. The problem with the shanty was that its thin wooden walls had no mass. They changed temperature with the whims of the air. What if she built a wall within the earth? A wall of stone, which would soak up the autumn sun's warmth through a south-facing window and radiate it back during the endless winter nights. For weeks, she became a ghost on the prairie, Fenn her silent shadow. She studied the land with her father's journal in hand. She found a perfect south-facing slope, sheltered from the prevailing northern winds by a rocky spine of land. The soil was right, a stable clay-loam mix that wouldn't slump. Using a pointed stick and a ball of twine, she laid out her vision on the earth, a rectangle dug back into the hill, wider than the shanty, with a front wall that would hold a door and a window scavenged from an abandoned homesteader's wagon. The work began with the blistered hands and aching muscles the prompt demanded. Her tools were brutally primitive: a single pickaxe, a shovel with a cracked handle bound with wire, a heavy iron bar for prying stone, and a makeshift sled of buffalo hide and willow branches. The first day, she cleared the sod, painstakingly setting aside the thick, matted squares to be replaced later. The second day, the pickaxe met the hard-packed earth. Each swing was a jarring negotiation. The impact traveled up the haft and into the bones of her arms, settling as a deep throb in her shoulders by nightfall. Fenn watched, whining softly in his throat as if questioning her sanity. Within a week, her palms were a battlefield of raw, weeping blisters that she wrapped in strips of torn calico, dirt ground into the broken skin, a constant, gritty agony. She learned to swing the pick not with the strength of her arms, but with the weight of her body, pivoting from her hips. She learned the different songs of the earth, the dull thud of clay, the gritty screech of gravel, the satisfying clink when she hit the first layer of usable, flat sandstone. The conflict with the community began as curiosity. Old Man Peters, riding by on his sway, backed mare on his way to the fledgling settlement of Iron Creek, reined in and stared. "Digging a new privy, Miss Vance," he called, his voice tinged with pity. "A mite far from the house for convenience." "It's not a privy," Alara replied, not stopping her work. The shovel bit into the pile of loose earth. Peters squinted, his wrinkled face skeptical. "Well, what is it then?" "A cellar. You'll want it closer to home, believe me. Wolves'll get your stores otherwise." "It's a house," she said simply. He was silent for a long moment. Then, with a soft click of his tongue and a shake of his head, he nudged his horse onward. The story reached Iron Creek before she did. The true voice of the community's mockery, however, belonged to Josiah Coble. Coble wasn't the mayor, Iron Creek had no such thing, but he was its cornerstone. The blacksmith's arm was law, his anvil the heartbeat of the settlement. He was a man of wrought iron and proven methods, with a beard like a thicket of black wire and forearms corded with muscle. He arrived at her site 3 days after Peters, driving a wagon with his 2 burly apprentices. He did not call out a greeting. He simply stood, hands on his hips, and surveyed the growing hole in the hillside with the grim air of a coroner inspecting a wound. Alara felt his presence like a shadow. She straightened, leaning on her shovel, trying to ignore the tremor in her exhausted arms. "Miss Vance." Coble's voice was a low rumble, devoid of malice but full of absolute certainty. "What is this?" "It's my winter house, Mr. Coble." One of the apprentices snickered. Coble's gaze silenced him without moving. He stepped closer to the excavation's edge. "This hole. You plan to live in a hole? It's not just a hole. It will be earth-sheltered. The ground will keep it warm." Coble let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of profound disappointment. "Child, the ground is what freezes. The frost goes down 4 feet or more. You'll be sleeping in a block of ice." He gestured with a thick hand toward the pile of sandstone she'd begun to quarry. "And what's the stone for?" "To line your grave. Look, I respected your father. He was a dreamer, but a good man. This is a dream that'll kill you. A proper log cabin, chink tight, with a stone fireplace. That's what stands against a Dakota winter. This is what badgers do." The apprentices could no longer contain their grins. Alara felt a hot flush rise from her neck to her cheeks, a mixture of anger and crushing embarrassment. Her brilliant idea, her physics, reduced to the behavior of a burrowing animal. "The badger survives the winter, Mr. Coble," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "The badger has fur, Miss Vance. You do not." His tone shifted, becoming almost paternal, which was worse than derision. "This is a dangerous fancy. When the snow flies, you'll be welcome in Iron Creek. We've a community hall. No one will let you freeze. But this," he shook his head once more, a final verdict. "This is an embarrassment. To your father's memory, and to the hard work of every settler here who builds right side up, with timber against the sky." He turned and climbed back into his wagon. The apprentices followed, casting backward glances of mingled pity and amusement. The sound of the wagon wheels crunching away felt louder than the wind. Alone again, the vast, empty prairie seemed to press in on her. The hole in the ground looked suddenly like what they said it was, a grave for her foolishness. Fen nudged her hand with his cold nose. She looked down at his worried eyes, then at her own raw, trembling hands. The weight of the community's judgment was a heavier load than any stone. But as she looked at the south, facing slope, at the sun warming the exact spot where her room would be, she heard her father's voice reading from the journal. "The principles are sound." Physics did not care about mockery. The earth did not laugh. Clenching her jaw against the pain and the doubt, Alara Vance picked up her shovel again. The next swing into the unyielding ground was an act of defiance. The mockery did not fade. It crystallized into the social atmosphere of Iron Creek. Alara Vance, the badger girl, became a staple of conversation at the general store and smithy. Her project was no longer merely foolish, it was a moral failing, a rejection of community values and manifest destiny itself. Why build down when the whole point was to build up? To claim the sky. Her stubbornness was read as arrogance, her silence as disdain. This perception was cemented by Josiah Coble's public pronouncements. He saw her endeavor as a dangerous distraction that could lead to a preventable death, making it his business to dissuade her. That Vance girl is digging her pride in deeper than her cellar. He'd grumble to anyone who would listen. When the blue norther hits, we'll be digging her out. His words carried the weight of experience. He had survived 3 Dakota winters. What could a 17-year-old girl, led astray by a dead man's scribblings, possibly know? Meanwhile, Elara's world shrank to the dimensions of her excavation. The hole was now a stark, rectangular canyon in the hillside, 7 feet deep and 12 feet square. The real work, the work that would separate a damp pit from a habitable space, now began. Building the double wall. Her father's journal provided the critical insight. In an entry on ice houses, he noted, "The most effective insulation is often a void. Still air is a poor conductor. The heat cannot bridge the gap." She understood that a single stone wall against the earth would eventually leach cold. Her solution was to build 2 walls with a 2-inch air gap between them, a dead air space that would create a formidable thermal break. Executing this theory with her primitive tools was a feat of endurance that made the initial digging seem simple. The sandstone ledge was a half-mile away. Each usable slab had to be pried from the earth with the iron bar, a brutal process of leverage and shattering that filled the air with the sound of grating stone and her own grunts of effort. Once freed, a stone might weigh 40, 60, 80 pounds. She would wrestle it onto the buffalo, hide sled, her back screaming in protest, her bandaged hands slipping on the gritty surface. Then came the haul. Harnessing herself to the sled with ropes of braided rawhide, she would lean into the weight, becoming a beast of burden. Fen, sensing the importance, would often throw his shoulder into the back of the sled, his muscles straining in solidarity. Their progress across the prairie was achingly slow, a silent, grinding procession. The sled runners carved twin scars into the land, marks of her obsession. The wall grew, course by agonizing course. The inner wall, which would form the interior of her home, had to be meticulously flat and plumb. Without a level, she used a water-filled trough and a straight piece of wood. She became a connoisseur of stone shapes, her eyes learning to spot the flat face, the right-angled corner, the keystone that would lock a section into stability. Dry stack masonry was a puzzle where every piece weighed half as much as she did. She'd lift a stone, test its fit, reject it, try another, her arms trembling with fatigue. The outer wall, slightly taller, followed a foot behind, its construction slightly rougher. Between them, she used sticks as spacers to maintain the sacred, consistent air gap. As she built upward, she backfilled the space between the outer wall and the earth of the excavation with the loose, dry soil she dug out, creating an additional insulating berm. Her body became a map of her labor. The blisters on her palms hardened into yellow calluses as thick as saddle leather. A permanent ache took root in the small of her back. Her face, once pale, weathered to a brown tan, etched with fine lines from squinting against the dust and sun. She was no longer a beautiful girl in any conventional sense. She was something elemental, a creature of soil and stone. The final confrontation with the community occurred at the onset of true autumn. Elara needed supplies: a small pane of glass for her window, nails, a barrel of tar for waterproofing the roof she would build. She hitched the wagon, loaded a few precious bushels of her late mother's preserved tomatoes to barter, and with Fen beside her, made the long trek to Iron Creek. A hush fell over the main street as she arrived. Conversation stopped. She felt the stairs like physical touches. She kept her head high, walking straight to the general store. Inside, the proprietor, Mr. Gleason, was polite but cool. As she counted out nails, Josiah Coble filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. "Still at it, I see," he said, not unkindly, but with a wary finality that was worse. "The walls are up," Elara replied, her voice flat. One of the men by the stove muttered, spurring a ripple of laughter. Coble ignored them, his eyes on Elara. "I'll say it plain, girl. You come first, Snow. You come to the hall. This stubbornness, it does your pa no honor. He'd want you safe." Something in her, worn thin by isolation and pain, snapped. She turned to face the room, her gray eyes blazing. "My father's honor is in his journal. He wrote that the earth at 10 feet depth never freezes. He wrote that still air is a better insulator than wood. He wrote that a south-facing slope captures a winter sun's low angle. I am not being stubborn. I am being correct." The word hung in the air, shocking in its intellectual arrogance. To these men and women of action and grit, correct was something you did, not something you thought. Josiah's face darkened. "Correct. You think you're smarter than every soul who's built a home on this prairie. Your house has no chimney for a proper fire." It has a flue for a small stove, she countered, her technical precision a weapon. A large fire in a space that size would be inefficient and dangerous. The heat is meant to come from the walls, from the thermal mass charged by the sun. A stunned silence met her lecture. It was utter madness, warmth from walls, not from a roaring hearth. It was as if she had declared she would breathe water. Josiah Coble shook his head, a gesture of profound sorrow. "You're lost," he said softly. "When the cold finds you, remember the offer stands." Humiliation burned hotter than any anger. She completed her trade in silence, loaded her wagon, and drove out of town. This time, the laughter wasn't held behind her back. It followed her, open and dismissive. That night, a cutting north wind heralded the season's turn. It screamed around her shanty, finding every gap, but in her earth-sheltered shell, now roofed with sod, covered timber and tarred canvas, it was a distant rumor. She had moved her bedroll and stove inside. She lit a single candle. The silence was absolute, a velvet emptiness that soaked up sound. The cold air, heavier, settled on the floor. Near the ceiling, where her bed was, the air was warmer. The sandstone walls, having soaked in the autumn sun all day, emitted a gentle, radiant heat. She placed her palm against the stone. It was not cold. It was neutral, alive with a stored potential. Fen, who spent his evenings in the shanty shivering, lay stretched out on the earth floor, his sides rising and falling in deep, contented sleep. He did not curl into a ball. He sprawled as he had in the long-gone summers. Alone in the absolute quiet, Ella smiled. It was a small, private smile of vindication. The physics worked. The community, with all its certainty, was a noise on the wind. Her sanctuary was a fact in the earth. As she blew out the candle, the darkness was total and secure. Outside, the wind shrieked its promise of winter. Inside, the stone whispered back, ready. The promised cold did not simply arrive, it invaded. The first week of January 1881 was a prelude written in ice. The sky turned the color of dull iron, and the air grew so still and sharp it seemed to crackle. Then, on the morning of January 12, the wind awoke in the north. It did not rise, it erupted. This was no ordinary winter storm. This was the beginning of what would be chronicled in frontier annals as the Great Blizzard of 1881, also known as the Children's Blizzard, for its tragic toll. It was a meteorological monster, a polar express of Arctic air that collided with moist southern currents, resulting in a sudden, violent drop in temperature and hurricane, force winds that hurled snow not from the sky, but from the very surface of the earth. From the thick, imperfect glass of her salvaged window, Ella watched the world disintegrate. First came the snow, a blinding, horizontal scar that erased the line between earth and sky. Then, as the temperature plummeted faster than a stone down a well, the wind found its voice. It was a sound beyond howling, a deep, thunderous roar that vibrated in her teeth and made the very ground tremble. It was the sound of the world being unmade. Inside her earth house, the silence was profound. The roar was muffled to a distant, bear-like growl by the 4-foot berm of earth in the air, gapped stone walls. There was no shuddering of timbers, no shrieking through cracks. The pressure of the wind, which could flatten a poorly built barn, flowed seamlessly over the aerodynamic curve of her sod roof. She kept her small cast iron stove burning just enough to take the chill off the air near the floor, but the true heat radiated from the walls. The thermal mass of the sandstone, charged by days of low but diligent winter sun through her south-facing window, was now paying its endless dividend. The interior temperature held at a steady, breathable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a tropical oasis compared to the murderous cold outside. Fen was the living barometer of her success. In the shanty, he would have been a frantic, whining creature. Here he lay on the packed earth floor, rising only to stretch or to watch her with calm eyes. His peace was the final, living proof. The principles in her father's journal were not just sound, they were salvation. The second day, the symphony of destruction began. Carried on the wind came new sounds, the sharp, explosive siake of timber stressed beyond endurance, the long, wrenching tear of a roof being peeled away, the dull, final whoomp of a wall collapsing. Each sound was a life unraveling, a family's hope being buried in white. Elara thought of the Coble's sturdy cabin, its broad north wall assail against this wind. She pushed the thought away, guilt and fear warring within her. She had built her sanctuary, but she had not built it for them. On the third morning, the storm achieved a terrifying new intensity. The temperature, she would later learn, dove to 40 below zero. The wind, chill made it inconceivable. The air itself became a crystalline enemy, capable of freezing exposed flesh in minutes. The blizzard was no longer a storm, it was a white, screaming void. It was then, huddled with Fen by the stove's meager glow, that she heard it. Not the wind, but a desperate, rhythmic thudding against her heavy timber door. A human sound. Fen launched himself at the door, barking fiercely. Elara's heart seized. She threw on her bison coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and braced herself. Unlatching the door was a battle. The wind fought her for it, sucking it outward with terrifying force. A blast of air so cold it felt solid and burning slammed into her. Ice needles stung her face. Through the white chaos, two figures materialized, not walking but clawing their way toward her. Josiah Coble led, but he was a phantom of the robust blacksmith. He was coatless, his wool shirt frozen into a rigid board. His famous black beard was a solid, grotesque mask of ice, his eyes wide with a primal terror that had erased all thought, all pride. Clinging to him, nearly insensible, was his wife Martha. Her skirts were plates of ice. "Elara!" Josiah's voice was a raw, frozen scrape, swallowed by the wind. He collapsed against her doorframe, his strength spent. The north wall, it's gone. The roof gone. All of it gone. He didn't ask. The statement was a bare, shattered confession of total defeat. His world of proper logs, of right-side-up building, of community authority, had been annihilated by the impartial physics of wind and cold. Elara didn't speak. She hauled the door open wider against the gale, grabbed Martha's rigid arm, and pulled her inside. Josiah stumbled after. She threw her weight against the door, sealing the white hell out. The contrast inside was a physical blow. The sudden silence was deafening. The still, dense, warm air was a shock to their frozen systems. Josiah and Martha collapsed onto the earth floor, gasping, choking, their frozen clothes beginning to crackle as they thawed. Josiah's wild eyes darted around the room, taking in the impossible reality, the intact. Dry stone walls beaded with condensation from living breath, not frost, the steady flame of the oil lamp on her table, the calm dog now sniffing them with concern, not panic. He felt the radiant warmth emanating from the stones. He heard the absolute absence of the wind scream. He saw his wife, her color already improving from corpse, like blue to a painful, living pink. His gaze finally landed on Elara, who was already moving, pulling her spare blankets from her bunk, kneeling to chafe Martha's frozen hands. He looked from her determined, dirty face to the walls, to the gap between the inner stone and the outer earth. He now understood, to the small stove that was merely a supplement, not the source. The understanding did not come as a flash. It came as a slow, crushing avalanche, burying the man he had been. His mockery, his certainty, his paternalistic offers of rescue, they were not just wrong. They had been arrogant blasphemy against a truth this girl had seen and he had been blind to. She had not been building a hole. She had been building a furnace of stored sunlight, a fortress of still air. He had built a wooden kite, and the wind had taken it. A profound, shuddering groan escaped him, a sound of utter dissolution. Not a word was spoken. None were needed. The warm, silent stone walls were the only judge, and their verdict was absolute. But the trial was not over. An hour later, as Elara fed the Cobles hot broth, another frantic pounding came at the door. It was the Henderson brothers, boys of 12 and 14, their faces black with frostbite, their father lost somewhere in the whiteness between their collapsed claim shack and her light. She took them in. Then came Old Man Peters, half frozen, led by a gut instinct toward the only unnatural mound on the prairie that still breathed smoke into the murderous sky. By nightfall on the third day, her sanctuary, built for one, sheltered 8 souls and 1 dog. The air was thick, the space cramped, but the thermal mass of the walls absorbed the excess humidity and heat, preventing condensation from raining down. The small stove, stoked carefully, was enough. People slept sitting up, leaning against the radiant stone, their breath mingling in the lamplight. They were alive. In the great blizzard of 1881, in a sea of white death, Elara Vance's Badger Den was the only rock left above the tide. Josiah Coble sat in the corner, his thawed hands hanging between his knees. He watched Elara move, efficient, quiet, commanding, dispensing warmth, broth, and salvation from the very heart of the hill he had laughed at. He did not speak, but his eyes, when they met hers in the flickering light, held no remnant of the blacksmith, the authority, the skeptic. They held only the stunned, desperate awe of a saved man staring at the architect of his deliverance, a truth carved not in iron, but in stone and earth. The blizzard screamed itself out after 3 days, leaving a world transformed, a world of brutal, silent white, sculpted into sweeping dunes that buried fences, wagons, and the wreckage of dreams. The survivors emerged from Elara's mound like pale seedlings pushing through snow, blinking at the blinding sunlight. Behind them, the earth house exhaled a thin, steady plume of smoke, the only sign of habitation in a landscape of pure absence. The walk back to Iron Creek was a funeral procession. Where Josiah Coble's cabin had stood was a chaotic tumble of splintered logs and snow-filled void. The Henderson claim was a smooth, unmarked drift. Old Man Peter's shack had simply vanished. The community hall, a larger structure, stood but was ice, choked and inhospitable. 8 people were dead in the township alone. Many more were missing. But the 8 who had sheltered in the hill were alive. In the weeks that followed, as the grim work of recovery began, a quiet revolution took place. Josiah Coble was a man rebuilt from the inside out. The iron of his old certainty had been melted in the furnace of the wind and recast into something new, a profound, silent humility. He did not make speeches of apology. He took actions of atonement. He returned to Elara's homestead, not to criticize, but to study. He brought his measuring tools and asked quiet, precise questions. He would say, running a hand down the space between the stone lines in the unfinished front section. 2 inches was your measure. Yes, sir. Elara would reply. More than that, and convection currents can form. Less, and it loses effectiveness. He would nod, the title sir hanging awkwardly between them, a relic of a buried social order. He helped her chink the final outer wall with a proper lime mortar he mixed himself. He forged her a better, heavier door with iron hinges that sealed tight. When spring thaw finally allowed, Josiah began to rebuild. But he did not rebuild his old cabin. On a south-facing slope near the new town site, he built a hybrid structure, a stout log front for living space, backed into a hill. Its rear wall a replication of Elara's double-stone construction, bermed with earth. He called it a storm break. Others, seeing the blacksmith, the very avatar of practical wisdom, adopting the Badger Den principles, began to follow. The Vance design did not sweep the prairie overnight, but in a land now brutally educated about the limits of timber, it gained respect. Elara's father's journals, once seen as the scribblings of a dreamer, were copied by Josiah's careful hand. Diagrams of thermal mass, optimal south-facing angles, and air gap insulation were passed from homestead to homestead. Elara herself became a reluctant consultant, her quiet explanations of physics doing more to persuade than any boast ever could. She was no longer the Badger girl. She was the girl who had read the land and saved the people. A century and a half later, the wind still sings over the Dakota prairie, but it travels through strands of barbed wire and over seas of cultivated wheat. The Vance homestead is a fenced-off historical site, a gentle, grassy swell on the landscape that an untrained eye might miss. Dr. Anya Sharma, an architectural historian, kneels inside the preserved structure, now cleared of furnishings. Her headlamp illuminates the cross-section exposed by careful archaeological work. She points her laser thermometer. The interior, unheated for decades, is a consistent 52 degrees Fahrenheit while a late autumn frost grips the outside. "This is it?" she says to her graduate students, her voice hushed in the cool, clay-scented air. The perfect case study in vernacular passive survival architecture. See here, the double wall. That 2-centimeter gap is intentional, a dead air insulator. The sandstone has tremendous thermal mass. She positioned the single window at a perfect 15-degree angle to capture maximum low-angle winter sun. She runs a hand over the smooth inner stone, where a single faint chalk line, a tarly mark from a long-ago winter, might still be imagined. Elara Vance was 17. She synthesized indigenous knowledge, observational science, and brutal hard labor. Her design saved 8 lives in the blizzard of 1881 and influenced frontier construction for a generation. It's a testament to the fact that innovation isn't always about new technology. Sometimes it's about truly understanding the oldest materials of all, earth, stone, and sun. Outside, the students gather around the simple granite marker. It bears the names of those who sheltered there, and a quote from Josiah Coble's later memoirs. "We thought she was burying herself. We were wrong. She was planting a seed in that hill, and it grew a shelter that saved a town." Beneath it, carved in the stone, is the phrase from Thaddeus Vance's journal, carried through storm and vindication by his daughter. "Some ideas are too good to die with the people who have them." The wind picks up, sweeping across the miles. It is the same wind. But here, against this particular hill, it loses its bite, buffered by the enduring, intelligent swell of earth and stone, a whisper of warmth, stubbornly persisting in the cold.